Welcome to the Sex is Good podcast. This is a podcast about the science of sex. Because the more you understand it, the more that guilty little impulse starts to feel, well, healthy.
I'm Robert.
And I'm Anna.
Welcome, everybody. Well, if you take a medication for sex, it's an almost certainty that it is a generic medication. How do I know that? Because 90% of all medications that Americans take are generics. But here's what we're going to talk about today. Did you know that 80% of the active ingredients in generic medications are made in places like China or Turkey or India? And does that matter? Does that matter to your pocketbook? What if we have a war with China? Are these medications safe? What caused this shift to begin with? Because in the 1980s, the early 1980s, only 10% of medications were generics, and virtually all medications that Americans took were made in the United States. Something dramatic has happened over the past 35 or 40 years. But Anna, you're about, 10 days away from heading off to Hedonism Resort in Jamaica? Is that right?
That is correct. I've started to figure out all of my outfits for the theme nights and think about what to do during the day and which events I'll be attending. I'm super excited.
It's going to be, what do you think, about 90 degrees there, something like that?
I don't know. I'm just hoping there's less rain this spring than there was last spring. It rained about 4 to 6 hours a day, so that was a lot of rain, but it was still a lot of fun. So,
and you're going to be managing you're going to be doing some classes, like some pole dance classes and some floor dance classes and things like that, and then also managing the weekly talent show that they have at Hedonism. Tell us about the weekly talent show at Hedonism Resort.
Well, every Thursday at Hedo, they open up the stage to any of the guests at the resort that want to perform. And we're going with a group called Casual Swingers, and there's a lot of really talented people in that group. My doubles partner and I will be performing, but we're also going to be orchestrating a bunch of people going through and making sure that they're ready to go. So we've got a lot of planning and preparation, including our own routine. So we've got a lot of work to do while we're there. We're probably going to be practicing a couple of hours a day, but hey, that's all right. I'll come back really fit from vacation.
There you go. If you come back fitter from a resort with free drinks and free food, well, you're doing pretty darn good. Anna, we have a rather controversial foreplay segment today that we're going to talk about. But before that, we have our Dirty Joke of the Week segment. What do you say? You ready for it?
I'm ready to laugh.
Well, if you're new here to the Sex is Good podcast, we have a few different segments. We have the introduction, which we just did. Therefore, you know what that's all about. And then we do the Dirty Joke of the Week. Next, we have the Foreplay segment, which is a brief news segment about sexual health. And then our main event, where today we're going to talk about medications, particularly medications that are coming from places like China and India. And then a little bit of aftercare, right, Anna?
That's right.
All right. So today's joke is, and the beautiful Anna judges the joke, and if she gives it a thumbs up, then we hear a, and if she gives it a thumbs down, then we hear a. Well, a police officer pulled over a motorist for going about 40 miles per hour over the speed limit. So the cop gets out of his car and he walks up there and he sees a man and a woman in the car. And he gets right in the driver's face and he says, "What the hell do you think you're doing, speed racer? Why are you going that fast?" And the husband who was driving the car started to respond, but his wife cuts him off and says, "Officer, I'll tell you right now, if there's one thing I've learned after being married to this man for 20 years, is there's no use even talking to this man when he is drunk."
Oh, she threw him under the bus.
We are not condoning drinking and driving.
Never.
I don't know that's not even really a dirty joke. We might have messed this one up, Anna. I don't know. It came out of Hustler's Dirtiest Jokes, Volume 2, the joke book, and I didn't even stop and think about it until right now that it's not even really a dirty joke.
It's not. You're right.
Let's say that she was naked.
Okay.
We'll do the whole thing over. We'll say she was naked, and then we've saved the whole segment that way.
Ta-da, magic.
All right, let's get on to that controversial foreplay segment. What do you say?
Let's do it.
Well, today's article was published on February 13th, 2026, and the headline is, should we change how often men who have sex with men are screened for STI? And yes, it says STI. I don't know why it says STIs, but that's their problem, not mine. I didn't write the headline.
That is a poorly edited title. You're right.
It says researchers from the Doherty Institute and the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne are proposing a review of the frequency for asymptomatic chlamydia and gonorrhea testing in men who have sex with men. This frequency, in their view, is leading to high levels of broad-spectrum antibiotic use, which may be contributing to an increased risk of antibiotic resistance. In a review which sought to outline the harms and benefits of the frequent screening of chlamydia and gonorrhea in men who have sex with men, which was published in the Lancet Infectious Diseases, the researchers suggest that there is limited evidence that frequent screening reduces the number of people living with these sexually transmitted infections in the community. This approach is supported by a recent United States Preventative Services Task Force systematic review, which concluded there was insufficient evidence to assess the balance of benefits and harms for screening for chlamydia and gonorrhea in men.
So basically, to sum it up, they're saying the opposite of what other people have been saying. They're saying test less when a lot of other people are saying test more and more and more. And I think that makes sense in this particular group of individuals they're speaking of.
Yeah, this conversation reminds me of COVID, which is essentially that if you test asymptomatic people enough, you're going to find more and more and more COVID, right? So imagine it's 2021. They would do things like COVID test all the workers at a meatpacking plant, and they would find out that a big part of them had it. You know, they already had antibodies for it. They didn't even know they were sick, but they had just worked through it. Other people had it actively and had no symptoms whatsoever. It was kind of that where it's like, okay, you're using these extremely sensitive PCR tests. So if the person has even a shred of the virus, or in this case, for these men, a shred of the bacteria in their system, you're going to catch it. But is that really a problem? It's a similar conversation, really, if you stop and think about it. Now, what's interesting here is that these are men who have sex with men. And so a lot of the consequences of asymptomatic chlamydia, for example, and in women, 70% of the time it's asymptomatic, is that you have problems like infertility, which you're just not going to have in men who don't have a uterus or a cervix or a vagina or any of these things, right, Anna?
And more importantly, these men are not coming into sexual contact with women, so they're not putting women at risk as well.
Exactly. Another consequence is that having an asymptomatic bacterial infection like gonorrhea or chlamydia more than doubles and in fact almost triples your risk of contracting HIV if you come into contact with HIV. Well, these men probably, hopefully, are on PrEP, which reduces the risk of HIV to essentially zero. So I completely understand where these researchers are coming from. It's like, who cares? This is their opinion, not mine. Okay, I don't really have an opinion on this, to tell you the truth. Their opinion, I could summarize it by saying, who cares? This guy has gonorrhea. He doesn't even know he has it. His body is probably going to clear it. His body is clearly winning the battle against it anyway, or he would be having some sort of symptoms. So who cares? He may spread it to somebody else who also doesn't have any symptoms. But by the way, if you're testing these guys continuously, you're just going to find more and more and more of it. And then you're going to have to treat with antibiotics. And let's slow down for a minute and reconsider if this is doing any good whatsoever, or if it may actually be doing harm. And I think that is really interesting.
It is interesting. And I think it also brings home the point that you and I make quite often. And that is, when people want to know when to be tested and how often, it takes you being mindful of your own risks. Who do you have sex with? How often do you have sex? Because there are people who say, oh, you should have a test after every partner. But if you have 4 partners in a weekend, that's a lot of testing, and it's not going to make a big difference in that period of time. So it's just be mindful, know what your risk is, and test accordingly.
Yeah, guess what, guys? The people who make Cheerios cereal think you should eat Cheerios every morning for breakfast. And people who run STI testing labs and STI testing companies like myself think you should get tested all the time, right? I mean, I've seen people say you should get tested after every single partner, which I just think is utterly ridiculous for some people. I know people that might have 3 partners every Friday night. Are they supposed to stop and get 3 different STI tests? Are they supposed to get tested every Saturday morning? Let's calm down here for a minute and just think, okay, what really matters more than frequency is thoroughness and something that's specific to you, which is what Anna said. Look, if you're a man who has sex with women, then not giving them gonorrhea or chlamydia is critically important for a whole host of reasons. If you're not on PrEP, even more important to find out if you have gonorrhea or chlamydia, or if you're just the kind of person who says, you know what, I'm not really living that high risk of a lifestyle. It's unlikely that I'm going to have any of these things, but it would crush me to know that I gave this to somebody. So I'm just going to get tested to make sure that I'm not that guy, air quotes, that guy that passes this along. Totally understand that. But the answer for everyone is not get tested more and more and more because, as these researchers are pointing out, you then have to treat them.
That's right. And if you don't have that risk factor, then your need to be treated is not necessarily as high.
The last thing I will say about this is someone who reads literally every peer-reviewed scientific journal that is released on STIs. I see every single one of them every single month. I can tell you that the vast majority of focus when it comes to STIs is on men who have sex with men, and that's true around the world. And that's fine, but you need to stop and consider something. If you are a woman, or if you are a man who has sex with a woman, then gay man-specific STI testing may not be appropriate for you. Let's consider this. If you go to virtually any county health department in the United States and get taxpayer-funded STI testing, it's almost certainly not going to have testing for Mycoplasma genitalium and Trichomonas. 2 things that you can argue don't make a tremendous amount of difference to men who have sex with men, but are devastating to women. So you need to just stop and think about what is the appropriate testing for you, and don't leave that up to a physician. Don't leave it up to a telehealth company. It's up to you, right, Anna?
That's right. You have to be your own best advocate when it comes to your healthcare.
All right. I cannot wait to talk about this medication because it is an absolutely fascinating topic. More fascinating than gonorrhea and chlamydia, I dare say.
Ooh, wow. That's really fascinating then.
I know. Let's get into it. Well, imagine everybody that it is 1980 and you go to the doctor and get a prescription written for you or your child or your parent or whoever, and then you go to the pharmacy and you get that filled. It's an almost certainty that that drug you now have in your hand is a name brand medication and that it was also made right here in the United States of America.
It's a totally different story in today's world. It's almost the exact opposite. And that's where 90% of the medications prescribed that are picked up at pharmacies today are generics. And about 80% of the ingredients in those generic medications and most medications are actually made overseas.
And we're going to talk about what made that change happen because that's the fascinating part of this story. And then we're also going to talk about, are there any safety risks? What happens when the FDA actually inspects, for example, an active ingredient manufacturing plant in China? Because sometimes what happens is really quite shocking. We're going to talk all about that. But first, Anna, I want to just ask you a question. If you had to ask the average American, do you think drug prices are too high or too cheap? What do you think they might say?
Well, I'm biased, as we all know, because my patients pay a lot of money for a lot of very expensive name brand drugs that are made. But I would say that for the most part, people would still say it just depends on how much they make, but hopefully they're saying they're cheap. That's my hope, but I think it's probably too expensive for a lot of people.
I would say 99% of people would say that medications are too expensive. And yeah, for your patients, absolutely, Anna. I mean, if there is a generic cancer drug, but there is a new version of it that's 20% more likely to save your life, who cares what it costs? We want our insurance company to pay for that, obviously, right?
That's right.
But I want everybody to just take a second And think about the absolute miracle that is inexpensive pharmaceutical drugs. Now, hold on. I know everybody wants to hit me with a pitchfork right now, but just stop and think about this. Let's think about something like, let's just think of something like a generic blood pressure medication. That active ingredient is going to be probably made in China. And this is not like knitting socks. This is extremely technical work with really, really highly educated people in extremely sophisticated laboratories full of extremely expensive equipment. This is high-tech manufacturing. This is not a sweatshop.
No, it is not.
And then that active ingredient is made and purified and everything like that. And there has to be this chain of custody. So that's the other side of this too, is that it's very highly regulated. And that also makes things usually pretty expensive. And then those active ingredients are shipped to a totally different country, probably India. And you could just imagine the transportation costs, where it's then put into capsules or tablets. And that is almost as sophisticated. It's not like there's just a machine crushes things together and spits them out like they're charcoal briquettes or something. You have to make sure that the active ingredient isn't deactivated, that it's going to dissolve properly. I mean, this is an entire science in and of itself. It's why they don't just do this at the factory in China. It is also a very specialized industry. So it's made in China. It's shipped to India, turned into tablets or capsules or something, and then shipped all the way to the United States, bought by one of the 3 drug wholesale companies. And generally speaking, there are 3 companies that are wholesale buyers of prescription medications. And then that wholesale buyer essentially sells it to your local Walgreens or your local grocery store or Cost Cut Plus Drugs, whatever pharmacy you use. And you can walk in there and buy a month's worth of this medication that you take every day. Sometimes for $3, sometimes for $4, something like that. And I think if you stop and think about it, that is wild. That is absolutely a miracle of modern industrialization and world trade.
It really is. When you think about how many hands that medication had to go through to get down your throat or injected into your body, it's crazy how many times it had to, how many transformations and metamorphoses it went through. And to still be that at affordable of a price, that's pretty miraculous.
It is. I think we lose track of the fact that for most Americans, you can work only a few minutes at your job and be able to afford a month's worth of many, not all. And God knows the medications you work with every day, Anna. Nobody could possibly make enough in their entire life to pay for them. But for many medications, I think we lose track of the fact that this stuff is so inexpensive that in a lot of cases, it's practically free.
It is pennies to the pound for sure.
Like, should I buy a Snickers bar and a Monster at the gas station or 4 months of my prescription blood pressure medication? I mean, stop and think about how inexpensive this really is. So this is a story that's worth telling in and of itself. All right, so we talked about that in 1980, only 10% of medications were generic, and now it's about 90%. Something happened in the 1980s, and I want everybody to listen and guess what year this took place. What do you say, Anna?
I'm excited.
Let me turn my attention to the real reason we're here this afternoon. Signing into law the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act of 1984. Legislation will speed up the process of federal approval of inexpensive generic versions of many brand-name drugs, make the generic versions more widely available to consumers, and grant pharmaceutical firms added incentives to develop new drugs. Everyone wins, particularly our elderly Americans. Fact is, it's estimated that consumers will save more than $1 billion over the next 10 years.
All right, so if you didn't guess 1984, then I'm sorry, you're just not listening very closely. Mr. Reagan actually said that during his
He
speech.
did. He gave a major spoiler right there.
It reminds me of all the rap music in the early 1990s when for some reason they would shout out the year it was. 1994. It was always like a part of the song. And now it feels like, oh my God, that was so long ago. But yeah, Anna, let's talk about this Waxman-Hatch Act, also known as the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act of 1984.
One of them was Mr. Waxman, and he was a Democrat, and he was actually in office from 1975 to 2015. So that was a nice long term of service right there. And he, like I said, was a Democrat, and the other one was Warren Hatch, and he was a Republican, and he served from 1977 to 2019, and they worked together to benefit as many ways as possible to get this type of an act through.
I feel like things used to be a lot better.
There was people talked versus fought, and that was nice because talking is way better than fighting.
Like, I couldn't imagine a Democrat and Republican doing anything together now, or even having the same idea about anything. But nonetheless, maybe it's happening more than what we realize, kind of taken aback by algorithms and things like that nowadays. But anyway, Anna, let's talk about what this act did. And I think it's the easiest way to understand this, to understand what it took to create a generic medication prior to this. Why don't you go ahead and explain that?
Well, what's really crazy when I think about it now is that if you were wanting to compete with a name brand drug before this act went into effect, you would have to repeat the exact same clinical trials that the name brand had gone through to get FDA approval. So essentially, you'd have to repeat all of that work all over again just to prove that your pill did what you said it did, even if it had the exact same ingredient, which was pretty crazy. So before this act, it just took too much time, too much effort, and honestly, too much money in order to make a generic drug.
Yeah, it just wasn't worth it. So I want to make sure people really understand this. So let's think about Viagra and sildenafil. All right, when Viagra was created, it was Pfizer that took it through the initial clinical trials. Okay, does it actually treat erectile dysfunction? Is it safe? And that took years and who knows how much money. A lot of money though, right?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, well, their patent eventually expires. Guess what? If you want to make a generic, cheaper version of Viagra, which we call sildenafil, you would have had to have went through that exact same process and prove it all over again, only to be able to sell something for much less money and much less profit than the name brands were. It's no wonder that there just weren't many generic medications back then.
That's correct. It was too much effort and too much money.
So now, after this act in 1984, essentially all you had to do was prove that you're making the active ingredient in a format that works. So sildenafil has already been through the clinical trials, for example. Now, all you have to do is prove that you are, in fact, making sildenafil, and voila, you have or voila. Which way is it, voila? Or
voila?
Oh, boy. Well, anyway, you now have a generic medication. So you can see how that caused the floodgates to open and created a lot of competition and drove down drug prices pretty substantially. So that explains why generic medications exploded and now they're commonplace, right? If you're on an ED medication, it's probably a generic. If you're on doxypep, it's probably generic doxycycline. Makes sense. But that doesn't really explain, Anna, why almost all of this manufacturing moved overseas.
That's right, Robert. And all of that transitioned basically after the World Trade Organization passed in 1995.
Right. So the WTO basically lowered tariffs and encouraged international trade. It reduced trade barriers and it made it easier for pharmaceutical ingredients and finished medications to move between countries. These medications now move from China to India to the United States as easy as, well, practically as easy as me driving something. I live in Illinois, me driving something over to Indiana. Like, it just made it worlds easier. And China was allowed into the World Trade Organization in 2001. Something else that I think people have to understand, and I've spent a lot of time reading about this and studying this over the past couple of weeks in preparation for this episode, is that countries like China, they're a planned economy. It's completely different than what we have here in the United States. So the ruling party decides that creating active pharmaceutical ingredients is something that they're going to really be good at. And so they plan the economy accordingly. They get people trained. They build entire pharmaceutical ingredient districts. And they make sure that, hey, this is the future for our country. This is one of the things that we're going to be better at this than literally anybody else. We're going to be so good at it, the companies have to use us to do this. And I don't want to try to say voila again, or did I say it correctly that time?
You did a great job.
But voila, they are exceptionally good at it. So good at it that you could never possibly compete with them in the United States.
At least not at their ability to do so at such an affordable price.
Yeah,
100%.
Absolutely. You could not do so at their cost. And there's a million reasons, environmental and labor. And for example, private property rights in China are nothing like they are here in the United States. We could go on and on about this, but essentially, suffice it to say, if China decides that they're going to be exceptionally good at something, they become exceptionally good at something, and it's very hard for anybody else to compete with them, quite frankly.
There's no resisting it. It's going to happen. You're right. Now, one thing that I think we need to pause and emphasize with all of this is that even though these drugs are made at a different place, a different culture, they still have to hit and meet the FDA standards of the US market. That is the only way that this whole system works, because if they don't meet that, then it's not going to get to the consumer.
Exactly. So the American Food and Drug Administration has something that they call Current Good Manufacturing Practices, also called CGMP standards. And these rules govern everything from chemical purity to how factories operate and how the medications are tested and documented.
They also inspect manufacturing facilities and even the ones overseas. So they're going to make sure that everything is done properly and so it gets to your body the right way.
At least we hope, right, Anna?
Oh boy, do I hope, yes.
I mean, inspecting a plant in the middle of China is not going to be as easy as inspecting one in the middle of Indiana. There's just no doubt about it. And these things are not inspected as often as someone might think, but we're going to talk a little bit more about that later.
That's right.
All right, Anna, let's take a short break here. We will be right back. I just want to remind everybody that the Sex is Good podcast is brought to you by Shameless Care, which is the telehealth company that Anna and I run. And I started Shameless Care because, quite frankly, I had gonorrhea and spread it to somebody. And the sad thing was I had just tested negative for gonorrhea. You see, my test did not include throat swabs. So we do a lot of things with medication, but today I want to talk about STI testing. And the things I really want you to understand when it comes to STI testing is that thoroughness is really what matters. Did you know that most cases of gonorrhea and chlamydia are oral or anal? The minority of cases are genital. So if your last STI test only included a genital test like a urine test and a blood test, then you weren't tested properly. The other thing to keep in mind is that all of our tests at Shameless Care begin and end with a doctor consultation. A real physician, one of our 25 board-certified physicians, is assigned to you, reviews your entire medical history over the internet, of course, sends you a test if you qualify, and then when your samples come back to the lab and they are analyzed, that same doctor, you don't go back into the pool, that same doctor is now your Shameless Care doctor, and they interpret those results and communicate them with you, and if you're positive, they treat you for free. Anna, are you ready to get back to the show?
Let's do it. Well, Robert, this system is generally working and truly saving Americans billions of dollars a year. But can you talk to me about examples where this wasn't necessarily the case or how things worked smoothly?
Yeah, Anna, there have been situations where factories in China have locked the FDA inspectors out. In one situation, when the FDA inspectors finally got in, the company had clearly been shredding records and falsifying documents and things like that. That hasn't happened now in a number of years, but there is still concern, deep concern amongst some people that this process is just going to be a little bit obfuscated because it is coming from China. And we don't have to look very hard, particularly around COVID, to know that information out of China is not always forthcoming. But I will say that the current Chinese regime has made this their goal to not only do this really well at a rate that nobody else could possibly compete with, but to do it safely and accurately. And it's been a number of years since there's been any particular issues with this process at all. And I don't want to go on and on about it because this podcast is not about, ooh, this is dangerous and we should all be scared. It's really more about this story and letting people understand how this became a generic medication country for the most part, and then how it became a generic medication consuming country, but not a generic medication manufacturing country anymore. There are also some people that are really concerned about if a war breaks out, for example, are we going to be able to get antibiotics and painkillers and cancer drugs and all the things that, we're going to need if we're dependent upon all of these other countries. But I think we have to stop and think about, what is the alternative? Are we going to force these companies to come back to the United States? Are we going to force these do we really want $10, $15, $20, $30 generic medications? I don't know that there's an appetite for that either. So I think for the time being, we're kind of in this world of world trade and our active and pharmaceutical ingredients coming from all around the world.
It's why there's so many things simmering in the background that we never hear about, things that don't make the flashy headlines that are so important to making sure our system actually works. So when you hear somebody say a simple solution, oh, just cut that off or whatever, the answer is, but wait, there's a whole lot you don't know about that's under the water. It's like the iceberg. You just see the tip. There's a lot more under the surface. And so there's a reason why it takes teams and troves of people to make all of this work, including, it's a small world. It really is. And so we all have to rely on one another to make it work.
Right. Everything's simple to a simpleton, right? And that's one of my favorite sayings. And a lot of times on this podcast, we don't make bold claims because everything is just so full of nuance, right? Like, is most of our active drug ingredients coming from places like China a good thing or a bad thing? Well, depends upon how you look at it, but it's definitely a thing that's probably not going to change anytime soon.
That's correct.
All right, Anna. Well, I think what people would be most interested in hearing right now is, let's say that your local Walgreens or one of the pharmacy partners that Shameless Care works with, when they want to buy medication, do they just call up China and order it directly, or how do they actually get those medications?
Well, there's always an intermediary, Robert, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the United States, there are 3 main wholesalers of medications. And those are McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and Cardinal Health. And these are the companies that buy medications from these foreign manufacturing facilities, import them into the United States. And remember, all of these drugs have chain of custodies going all the way back from the place where the molecules were first made and then shipped across the ocean to another country, formed into the medication, packaged, everything like that. Everything is completely documented. But when your local pharmacy needs, for example, doxycycline to fill doxypep prescriptions, they're getting it from one of those 3 wholesalers almost certainly.
So that's great to know about pharmacies where we can go and drop off a prescription or pick one up. But my question for you, Robert, is what about compounding pharmacies? Like, I know Shameless Care uses one. How does that system work with that particular set of circumstances?
I'm glad you asked that question, Anna, because one of the things that drives me crazy is when people use just an obvious thing as a marketing statement, right? So there is a large telehealth company, it's a great company, but all of their ads say that their compounded medication is made in the United States. And I think the inference is that others aren't. All compounded medications are technically whipped up in a pharmacy somewhere in the United States. But the active ingredient, so if somebody is making sildenafil and tadalafil troches, most likely the active ingredients were made from in an overseas factory somewhere and imported into the United States. And then the compounding pharmacy buys it from one of these wholesalers that we talked about.
That makes sense. So the ingredients are kind of like a recipe. If I wanted to make cookies, the cookies would be the thing that was manufactured by the compounding pharmacy, but the flour, the chocolate chips, the butter, all of that would come from other places, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Anna. So I think this story is really fascinating. What do you say we get into some aftercare and finish this conversation?
Sounds good to me.
Well, it's kind of wild to think about that the next time you pop that ED med to satisfy your wife or your wife's girlfriend or your whoever.
Or your wife's boyfriend, whoever it is.
Whoever, you're just satisfy yourself, whatever you're trying to do, that ingredient has traveled probably more than you have in the past few years. And that's just fascinating for me to think about. I think these things are just so interesting. But Anna, somebody on Reddit a couple of weeks ago, and that's really what started me down this rabbit hole, quite frankly, said that his sildenafil was working fine. And then his doctor, ordered a refill for him, and he went and picked it up at the pharmacy. And this new stuff just sucked. It didn't work. And he got a headache and stuff like that. And so it was just like a different manufacturer. And so I just want to talk about that.
Well, sure, because just like we said, and just like the regulations have shown, these generic drugs have to have the same amount of active ingredient, and it has to act the same way in the body. So, it's one of those things where there's other components at hand here.
Yeah, this isn't like Energizer batteries versus Costco batteries or Great Value batteries or, cornflakes versus generic cornflakes. It's supposed to literally be the exact same thing. So, if that happens to you, you need to report it to the FDA, and you can easily Google that FDA reporting line, because that's not just a you problem. That's just not a throw these in the trash and go back to Walgreens and get another bottle. That could be a national emergency. If you truly do feel like your medication was completely ineffective or contaminated, that's a huge, huge problem that extends way beyond your personal sex life, right, Hannah?
It's actually very true. I will never forget, we had a series of reactions to a particular medication that we saw in our practice when it came to cancer care. And it was so out of the realm of what was ordinary. We actually ended up reporting that batch of drugs to the FDA. And it turns out that batch of drugs had a flaw in it, and that was causing a bunch of allergic reactions. So these things are important to report. You can save lives.
The other thing I want to mention about this briefly is that these generic medications are more or less a commodity. If you go to Walgreens, CVS, Walmart, Joe's pharmacy down the street, whatever, and you get 50 milligrams of sildenafil, it's the same really no matter where you get it. What truly matters is the healthcare that comes with it. And talking once again about Reddit, I answer questions on Reddit every single day from people that should have just been able to ask their, pause so I don't curse, doctor. Like, somebody who has Doxypep from God knows where and has no idea how to take it. And they're sitting there asking perfect strangers on Reddit. And one of the things we're so proud of at shamelesscare.com is if you are a patient, and you are a patient, not a customer at shamelesscare.com, you just log on to the website and text your doctor whenever you want. It could be right. 8 months later. Hey, doc, I'm getting a headache from this sildenafil. What do you think, right?
That's right. And it's super important to have that relationship with your providers, because they're there to help. It's our job to do no harm. Literally, we have to take that vow. And so it is important that you have that access, because it helps with overall care. And let's be honest, it's pretty sexy to have access to full health care.
To sexual health experts?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for listening, everybody. And we will see you in a few days.